part 7 of Understanding Islam, Unpacking the Dhimmi Pact. We're going to speak now about the Dhimmitude of the West. This is the voluntary adoption of a dhimmi worldview by people who actually live freely and not under the dominance of Islam, but nevertheless adopt psychological characteristics of being conquered people. It is an option that is offered to non-Muslims by Muslims. You have two places to stand. You're either an enemy or you're a dhimmi. And so it's a package that's offered spiritually to non-Muslims to partner with Muslims. One thing that's very interesting and important to note is that the dhimmi itself is denied by a number of strategies, both by Muslims and non-Muslims. There are ways in which it is glossed over and people pretend it is not what it actually was. For example, sometimes people say the jizya was, you remember it's a compensation, they say it's a compensation for not paying zakat. A Muslim has to pay 2.5% of his property as zakat each year, and that is the alms to the poor, and it's said that jizya is something that the non-Muslims paid instead of that. Another thing is to say it was just a tax like any other tax. I mean, after all, everyone has to pay taxes. Or it's a compensation from being exempted from military service. Non-Muslims were not permitted to fight in the jihad. I wonder why. It's a religious war. But it is said by some that the jizya was an exemption from military service. Another claim that's made is it's a payment for protection, and dhimma means pact of protection, very widely made claim. Yes, it is, but it's protection from the Ummah, it's protection from Muslims. And some say it was a light tax, not really a heavy tax. In fact, it was very heavy. Studies have shown around about 700 say that the tax was 25% of an annual average worker's wage, and even more sometimes. And there are many accounts from history of people having to sell their family or themselves into slavery and to pay their debts, or just fleeing and wandering destitute because of this. It's actually the reality of history is that it's a very heavy tax. One Jewish scholar, Goitin, said the thing he had to change his mind most radically when he looked at the evidence from the Geniza documents from the Jewish communities was how damaging the tax was. Because when he read the jurists, it seemed, oh, this is not such a bad thing for the non-Muslims. But when he saw the actual evidence of history, it was a very heavy burden. Here's an example of a Christian leader who's been very influential in the UK, training people about Islam, who replicates some of these lies. This is Colin Chapman in his book Cross and Crescent. All non-Muslims living under Islamic rule paid a land tax. Jews and Christians were treated as dhimmis, members of a protected community, and paid in addition a poll tax, the jizya. They were not allowed to do military service or pay the Muslims' arms tax. So that's his paragraph in Cross and Crescent on what it means to be a non-Muslim living in an Islamic state. Notice how he ticks some of the lie boxes. They weren't allowed to do military service. They weren't allowed to pay the Muslim tax. They were a protected community. So he has just bought into this narrative. And to be a bit personal for a moment, when I read that paragraph, which is all he has to really say about this in his book, a hugely influential book for Christians, helping educate them about Islam, I was deeply, deeply disappointed, because it's a very misleading statement. It is a statement full of lies, dressed up as candy, dressed up as nice things to say, but they're actually not true. People in the West have indulged in a whole kind of litany of deceptive and untrue statements about Islam. After 9/11, President Bush came out and said that true Islam is non-violent, Islam is a religion of peace, and a Taliban spokesman said he was astonished. Is President Bush some kind of Islamic scholar? But you see, non-Muslims living under Islam, they have to praise Islam. They're expected to. They're duty-bound to be grateful. So they can't criticize Islam. This is the response of a conquered person. Tony Blair, on announcing a grant of £1 million to support the study of Islam in British universities. Many Western governments have fallen over themselves to invest money in teaching Islam or studying Islam in universities as a way, hopefully, of moderating the Muslim community and to show their good faith. Let's pay money to the Muslim community or to Muslim causes to show that we love Islam and that we're not a threat to them. He said the voices of extremism are no more representative of Islam than the use in times gone by of torture to force conversion to Christianity represented the teachings of Christ. That bears a bit of thinking about. He's saying, gee, Christians have done terrible things. And if Muslims do bad things, that's not real Islam at all. After all, we're guilty. So he's actually adopting a kind of guilty speak. We've done bad things as Christians, while exculpating Islam. You know, there's no real problem with Islam. Islam's not the problem. And that's, again, this is the speech of a dhimmi. I'm at fault. I'm culpable. I've done these terrible things as a Christian, but Islam is pure and perfect. A judge in Australia was asked to rule on a case involving two pastors who'd criticised Islam, and his ruling included the finding that the violent verses in the Quran don't apply after the 8th century, and it's vilifying of Muslims in Australia. It's against the law to say that these verses have any applicability after the 700s. Our Equal Opportunity Commission engaged in a program promoting positive regard for Islam to school children and others, and it says in the Standing Up to Racism information they produced that Islam gives its followers the right to absolute and complete equality before the law. It's not true, because women and slaves are not equal in Islam, and also it's deceptive because the issue is not just whether Muslims are equal, but whether non-Muslims are equal as well. So these sorts of statements are being made a lot in the West. The British constables, the police, would have a sign of the crown on their helmet, this little crown. On top of the crown, you can't see it here, but there's a cross. And British police complained, that were Muslims, complained that they had to wear a cross. So the British government gave them a concession not to have the crown on their helmets because it would offend them. Remember, non-Muslims are not supposed to display the cross, so the Muslims said, I can't be a policeman if there's a cross on my helmet. And so the British took the sign of their sovereignty off their police helmets. To me, that's an act of self-rejection. It's the rejection of their own Christian identity and of their own sovereignty, and spiritually a foolish thing for them to be doing. This is a report from Canon Patrick Sukdeo. In South London, Muslim gangs armed with guns have targeted Christians, saying that if they don't convert, they'll be killed. In Bradford, a Christian family converted from Islam have had their lives threatened. Their car has been arsoned and they've been threatened with violence. The Bishop of Bradford met this family with his interfaith advisor, probably a bad sign itself. At this meeting, he stated that the diocese of the Anglican Church would not welcome such converts into it. So what's going on here? These are obviously very troublesome people. There's people trying to burn their car. They're causing a lot of difficulty. They're causing disharmony in the community. We don't want those kinds of people in our church. They're just a source of so much confusion and distress. Now, this is what Christians living under Islam, this is how they respond. If someone comes to you and says, I've converted to Christianity, will you help me? And if they help you, they're breaking their pact of surrender. They're making themselves and their community liable for attack. So they say, I'm sorry, we can't help you. But to see a bishop in England come to the same conclusion, to respond in fear in this way and to be conditioned by fear, it's kind of incredibly grieving to see that. That here is a bishop in England who's thinking like a dhimmi. He's down the track. He's got to reach dhimmi level 3. He's on the way to the full deal and is acting in that way. How devastating for that family to be told that by a bishop. Mary Robinson was the President of Ireland, and after that she became head of the Human Rights Commission for the United Nations. And on March the 15th, 2002, she gave a speech in Geneva. It's an interesting speech as an example of dhimmi speak, of a kind of dhimmi rhetoric. She said, it's important to recognise the greatness of Islam, its civilizations and its immense contribution to the richness of the human experience, not only through profound belief and theology, but also through the sciences, literature and the arts. No one can deny that at its core, Islam is entirely consonant in agreement with the principle of fundamental human rights, including human dignity, tolerance, solidarity and equality. Numerous passages from the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad will testify to this. No one can deny from a historical perspective the revolutionary force that is Islam, which bestowed rights upon women and children long before similar recognition was afforded in other civilizations. And no one can deny the acceptance of the universality of human rights by Islamic states. So think carefully about what she's doing. She's a Christian woman, a leader, and she's thanking Islam for giving her human rights. She's thanking them as a woman and as a Christian. She's expressing gratitude and also humility. She's humbling herself. Our pathetic civilizations weren't able to be advancing human rights like Islam was. This speech was written for her by a Muslim supporter, advisor in her team. So the Muslim knew the kind of rhetoric that a dhimmi needed to make in order to speak to Muslims, which she was doing. Notice also the silencing. Shut up if you disagree. Shut up if you have another voice. You cannot say anything else. This is the official story. There's only one story. Islam is the source of all justice in the world. And she is really humiliating herself. This is the kind of speech you give if your life is threatened, if you're under pressure. And it's a kind of societal, civilizational insanity that she should be saying such things. Here is Sarkozy, former president of France. Islam is one of the greatest and most beautiful civilizations the world has known, he said. He was given a sword by the king of Saudi Arabia, and there he is receiving his sword. I wonder if he understood what the sword is for. We will convey our deep appreciation for the Islamic faith, said President Obama, which has done so much for over the centuries to shape the world, including in my country. Obama, on behalf of the United States, is expressing the debt that the US owes to Islam. Remember, one of the attitudes of dhimmis is gratitude, humble gratitude. The Yale theologians wrote a letter in response to the Muslim Common Word letter in 2007, which was signed onto by many Christians. And it's a very interesting letter. I critique it on a site. I have a Common Word blog, which I have about 5 articles critiquing that letter. One of my criticisms is that the organisation that promoted that letter on its website had fatwas declaring that Christians should be killed. If people had left Islam, they should be put to death. The same people that produced the letter. But that certainly got a response from the Yale people when I informed them of that. They hadn't done much research into the matter, I think. But the things that really struck me about the letter was that they adopt a tone of humility and gratitude. Notice I've marked the phrases. Many Christians have been guilty of sinning against our Muslim neighbours. The Muslims didn't say they were guilty. We ask forgiveness of the All-Merciful One and of the Muslim community throughout the world. We are the guilty ones. We are culpable. We need to pay our jizya. We need to compensate you. In the generosity with which the letter is written, you embody what you call for. You are very generous to us, to let us live, to let us keep our heads, to whatever it is. It's with humility and hope that we receive your generous letter. Now, I'm pressing it a bit, but I'm saying that this attitude of humility and generosity, which is named so explicitly here, is exactly the psychology of the dhimmi that's required by Islam. So even mission agencies, even Christians, even whole churches can become infused with this attitude of gratitude and humility towards Islam. It can actually damage and entrap the soul of individuals and of organizations. Often the symptom of it when I speak with people is they say, oh, you have to be loving. Loving is the most important thing. And I say, well, what about the truth as well? You know, you need love with truth. You need both. You don't just want to be playing the battered wife role in relation to Islam. You need to be able to speak the truth as well. But we have a kind of a crisis, really, in the West of the spiritual worldview of Dhimmitude, and needs to be exposed and named for what it is. We need to find ways of communicating our faith which do not fall into these traps of declaring ourselves to be guilty, declaring ourselves to be humbled by the generosity of Islam. And that's the end of part 7.